Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to all the organizers for thinking of having me. And I love a meeting that starts with a high five. It's always a good sign for the day. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Jesse Wente. I am Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. My people come from Serpent River First Nation, which is a very small community, about 7 hours northwest of where we sit today on the north shore of Lake Huron, which is the world's largest freshwater lake and very central to the Anishinaabe people. That's where my one side of my family come. The other side of my family comes from a very small town, even smaller, that you've probably never heard of, called Chicago. But you know, we came, Serpent River, I was just there, and I'm so thrilled that we're here in this location. I understand this is your first day here, and this is a pretty wonderful place. I encourage you to check out, they have an amazing garden in the back, and it's always good to wander the garden. And we're actually in something that they now call the Don River Valley, which is a glacial valley. And my grandmother used to tell me a story about the river that's there, and how in the old times this river was so thick with salmon that you could walk across it on the backs of the fish. It's an elder story. We laugh because we think it's made up. In reality, it often turns out that they were actually just telling the truth and we just didn't believe them. Now, I was going to make a presentation. I'm going to talk what the slides you're going to see, with numbers and facts and stuff and all that good stuff. But I figured you folks, you're going to see a lot of that in the next couple of days. And we're the first session of the day. So in fact, what you're just going to see is beautiful images of the land here in Canada, or what my people would call Turtle Island, which is all of North America. And I think it's just a calming way to sort of enter the day and think about it, but it does have a point. I will bring it all together about what you're seeing. So just enjoy. These are all photos taken by me all over Turtle Island. So you'll get to enjoy them, and then I will talk a bit about what they mean at the end. So I am going to talk about art and how it can build bridges. One thing I'm going to say, though, is I will probably interchange the word art and storytelling. And that's because I generally believe that all art is telling you a story, whether it's actually a book or a movie, a story-based sort of medium, or a painting or a song or anything. It's all storytelling, and storytelling is so incredibly central. It's actually the most central thing to how we understand the world, is how stories are explained to us, how we understand ourselves, how we relate to each other, the stories we know about each other. You guys are going to socialize, and what are you going to do all day? You're going to tell your story, you're going to listen to other people's story, you're going to exchange stories, and you'll get to know each other and collaborate. Storytelling is very fundamental to how we as humans interact with the world and understand it. And I would also say the reason I don't differentiate is because for the Anishinaabe, in our language, there actually isn't a word for artist or art, because we didn't see it as somehow separate from life itself, of humanity. And so there was no conception that if I paint, which many people did, you can go see petroglyphs in Northern Ontario that are 15,000 years old on the rocks. They didn't think of painting that as like art that should be in a gallery. That's not how they viewed it. They viewed it as storytelling, and we opened with that beautiful song, which was a story. That told you a story. No words, but it told you a story. And so for us, and for me, I'm not sure, for me there isn't a distinction. Art is storytelling, storytelling is art, all mixes together, and it's all really foundational to our human experience on this planet. And art is very much the expressions of it, the way we think of it, whether it's a song or a dance or a play or a movie, they're really the language of culture, which is that storytelling piece. So that's how people are expressing that storytelling urge, that urge to define us culturally, because that's what storytelling does. And so all the different arts, photography, is all really based in the language of storytelling. And I would suggest to you that there's really two ways art helps build bridges, or at least two ways that we currently think about it. And the first way is by doing it, by creation, the actual creating of something artistic, collaborating with people to actually make something that couldn't have existed without that collaboration. So really art's practice as a way to build bridges. And we actually see this expressed in a number of ways. In Canada, we have our arts are robustly funded by the state. So I sit on the board of something called the Canada Council for the Arts, which is the largest funding body for arts in all of Canada. It gives out, $500 million a year to artists. I sit on the Toronto Arts Council board, which does the same for artists here in Toronto. And so what we've seen at those funding levels is a lot of effort put into that idea of co-creation, of making art as a way for people to communicate with one another. For example, we've seen a lot of success with what we call newcomer programs. So this is really programs for recent immigrants to Canada to meet in an artistic space, to co-create art. And in doing so, the idea is that they learn a little bit about Canadian culture, Canadians learn a little bit about them, and integration sort of goes a little bit more smoothly and everything pays off. And I think there's actually real value in this. We've seen amazing uptake or engagement by newcomers who really want to get to know what Canada is and see creating art as central to that. Art creation allows the opportunity to meet, to use the power of participation to break down any preconceived ideas or notions or barriers that may exist. It's also universal. Like, you cannot find me a culture that does not create art, because if it doesn't create art, it isn't a culture. So there is no place where you are going to go find a people that somehow don't storytell on some level. It's literally what separates us from the animals, right? The animals don't really tell each other stories. They might tell each other about us, but they don't really tell each other stories. But we do, because that's how we communicate. Animals exist on instinct and nature. And so we've seen a lot of bolstering of this particular idea of art participation as a way to break down barriers. The second way is really through what I guess we would call art appreciation, but I actually don't think it matters if you appreciate the art. Like, if you don't like it, it's actually sort of secondary to the experience of seeing it. You may not take as much away from it from if you don't, appreciate it. But there's lots of stuff that I didn't appreciate reading back when I was a kid, and it absolutely informed me about different cultures and different people and different places. Some of it is forced on you in school, but guess what? Well, as adults, we realize, hey, that wasn't crazy that we read that. That was actually good that we read that and learned that. And as has been suggested a few times, I think we need to be a little bit more embracive of just who we let into that circle of influence that we all have. And so appreciation really comes when we consume art, when we watch it, when we go to a gallery, any of those sorts of things. And this happens because it's a shared moment of storytelling, right? This is where when you participate in art, you're telling the story. When you appreciate art, the story is getting told to you. Your life may fill in some of those gaps in the story, but that's really a moment where, like we're doing right now, you're all sitting here listening to me tell you a story, and you're having a shared experience. And hopefully, it will break down some bridges as we go along. So art in all its forms is a communication for storytelling. And our brain, I talked about the difference between us and our animal kin, and Anishinaabe view animals as kinfolk. They are related to us, and we to them. And so when I talk about kin, I don't actually mean my family. I mean that the birds and the bees and everything else are also my family, because we view the world relationally, if you understand what I mean. We view that we're in relationship with everything, and that there's obligations under that relationship. So if I'm related to the animals, I actually have an obligation to them, just like I do to the tree and everything outside. We're all in kin with those folks. And so as humans, though, it's our brain that really allows us to imagine, and this is where the storytelling magics. And it gives life to our cultures. It's really actually what makes our cultures real is storytelling. Because what is Canada as a thing without the stories that actually tell you what it is? It's just a place on a map that frankly someone else drew. I don't even know what that map is for me, but someone else drew it, and it's got a thing, word, Canada. You know what Canada means, actually? The story Canada likes to tell itself is that Canada means settlement. That when the first settlers came, they talked to the Iroquois pointed to the town that was behind them and said, Kanata, settlement. It actually is a little bit different than that. It actually means those who squat on the land. Storytelling, right? So the one story that Canada says is we're the settlement. What the Iroquois actually meant, no, it's the people that sit. That's what that is. And which I actually think is a very appropriate name for Canada, that name. So I'm actually quite happy it adopted that. But it maybe needs to change the story it tells around that name so it can have a better understanding of itself, because it's maybe not telling the story exactly correctly. And storytelling is completely essential to our national identities, to our personal identities. We all have our own story that we tell, to our community, to our organizations. If you work with an organization, it's telling you a story. It's telling the world a story outside of its place of what it does, who it is. That's how it defines itself. Like how much, I'm a movie geek. That's where I got my start. I was a film critic for like 20 years on the radio here, reviewing movies. Great gig if you can get it. I'm not sure it exists anymore in the world of jobs. And I just can't, how much have I learned about different cultures through their movies, right? And how much do what we make as movies contribute to our own understanding of ourselves? Enormous amounts. I mean, I had no idea what a Japanese tea ceremony was until I watched a Ozu film and actually understood and got to see what it was. So art really has that really incredible capacity, and that's why most nations are very much involved in the creation of art and the storytelling around it, because they understand that's what makes them real. That all that other stuff is just, like a map is storytelling. Someone authored it. They're telling you a story about the map. If I drew the map, it would be a different story. It would tell you a slightly different view of this place. So it's why nations ultimately need to support and nurture artists and their artistic communities, because without them, they can quickly lose what it is that their national identity is. Canada has always struggled with this as a settler colonial nation, where the Canada was formed by people coming here from different places. And amalgamating, right, into something, and they've always struggled. What is Canadian identity? We don't know what it is. Is it hockey? Because we'd really just like it to be hockey, because we're really good at hockey. And so let's be, but hockey's like a sport. Is that really it is vaguely storytelling. And if you're a Maple Leafs fan, it's a tragedy. But for, it's not, I'm not sure it's necessarily like the national culture. Sometimes we point to like companies, which is disturbing if you take your national identity from corporations. So like sometimes in Canada we'll point to Tim Hortons. I don't know how long you folks have been in the country, but I guarantee you've seen a Tim Hortons. And again, I don't think, we all enjoy the Timmies, but I don't think that's really a national identity. I actually think, and I can get to this, but I actually think what you're watching on the screen is Canada's national identity. And if you go out into the park, you'll see it. Because the thing that's most defining about Canada, if we're really honest, is the land. This extraordinary place and its vastness and its riches and all of that it could sustain if we would actually treat it properly. That's really what Canada, I think, is central to it. It's why you actually see the land so much in Canadian art, even if Canadian artists don't necessarily know that that's the national story they're telling. There's a reason why people are drawn so much to the land here. And so I think it's really important that we support this sort of artistic practice and storytelling, and that nations do this. And it's really what I've devoted when I look back on it, what I've devoted my entire professional career to is storytelling, making space for stories, as a broadcaster, telling stories, helping other people tell stories. I work for something now called the Indigenous Screen Office, where I run the Indigenous Screen Office, which is all about empowering more Indigenous creators to tell their stories on screens, to make our screen sector a little bit more equitable. And when I was preparing for this talk, I was really thinking about why that is so important to me. Why I care so much about art and storytelling, because all my day is talking with artists and talking about how to make stories. And I think what I've come to understand is that the reason it's so important to me as an Anishinaabe person is that I know what it is to lose our stories. I know what it is for our art to be hidden. And I even actually know what it is for our art and our stories to be illegal in Canada. And I think it can often be hard to know the true value of something until you have it taken away. And I think nations like Canada, who've had the storytelling ball in their court for a couple hundred years now, one of the reasons they struggle with national identity is they've never had someone come and take it. And in the globalized world, right, where suddenly there's Netflix and all this other stuff, where culture and art and storytelling is consumable on a global level, where the barriers from me watching a film, say, from Korea, when I was a kid, to watch a film from Korea meant a whole lot of things had to happen before I could watch that movie. Like, a whole bunch of stuff had to happen. All that has to happen now is I have to have a web browser, and I could be watching a movie from Korea here 2 minutes from now. And in that moment, places like Canada are suddenly like, oh my goodness, what do we do? What do we have to do? Because it's the first time they've been faced with the existential threat of their storytelling ability being taken away. And Canada actually recognized this when it was a little, even more of an infant than it is now as a nation, when we started things like arts councils and had broadcast acts and all of these policies to make sure that Canadian storytelling would remain viable in a future global marketplace. And so maybe as an existential threat, Canadians are beginning to feel what it's like if your culture, because there's all this concern about, well, if Netflix comes here and they start telling Canadian stories, but they're an American company, are they Canadian? You should ask some Indigenous people about that, because we're sort of experts in what this feels like. And so I'm going to tell you a slightly different story. Are the slides moving, by the way? Are the images changing? Let's hope so. There we go. Right now I'm actually working with an artist on a storytelling piece Around town, you may see them. I think there's an app that'll tell you where to find them. These historical plaques that are all around. They put these things to tell you the history of different places and all this stuff. And my dad has always loved these things. We would go on drives when I was a kid, and they'd have sign, historical plaque, and he had to pull off. And it would be about like the cotton gin or something. And I'm like, oh my God, Dad, it's dreadful. Well, very proud moment for me. I got to tell my dad, Dad, I'm gonna write a historical plaque. Someone's actually asked me to write it. They're gonna carve this thing in stone. They're gonna carve my words in stone. Very intimidating. But it's an interesting project because it's about, in 1908, at Hanlon's Point here in Toronto, down by the lake shore, workers were digging a tunnel. And they uncovered an extraordinary thing. They uncovered a rock that in it had footprints. And these footprints of moccasined feet, it was more than 100 footprints walking away from the lake, north from the lake. They were of a family because they could see little kids' footprints and big footprints and small footprints. And they could tell they were wearing moccasins, by the way, because you couldn't quite see the foot. It was covered by a hide. And they discovered this, and this was actually the first evidence of how long people have been in this place, because this rock is 12,000 years old. These footprints are 12,000 years old. These are my ancestors walking. And it was 1908, and they were building a tunnel. So can you guess what they did? They poured cement on it. It's buried. You can't see these footprints. It's gone. Now this is Canada. This is what happened here. It's still happening, by the way, right? Where we're even in an example of it. Literal brickworks, but building cement things on top of other things. And so in covering up these footprints, in obscuring and burying this part of history for this land, that story was never really told. And so, we had people come up earlier, Chris, and and talk about how we're still figuring out things about Toronto. Well, why is that? Because we poured cement on the stories that were here, and we built things above them, and now you can't see them. So this artist project, Dean Baldwin and Carolyn Monet, who's an Algonquin artist from Montreal, what they've done is they poured fresh cement and had a bunch of First Nations people walk across it in moccasins to recreate these footsteps. And that will now be housed down near where these footprints were originally discovered. You'll be able to stand on them with them, and my oh so profound words will be carved into stone next to them. And I tell you the story because I think it is very symbolic of what happened here in Canada, and because it tells you that there's always a story beyond the story you've heard. And that one of the challenges we face now is how to recover these stories. Because it wasn't just that Canada discovered things and poured cement on them. I'll give you a bit of a history lesson. So Canada's founded in 1867 by an act of British Parliament. They, in 1876, so their country's 9 years old, they passed something called the Indian Act. This is still a law in Canada that governs the relationship between Indigenous people and the state or the crown. And it does a number of things, the Indian Act. Its three primary purposes was to institute the reserve system. So when you look at a map, even if you look at a map that has all the Indigenous communities in Canada identified, and there's 613 in Canada, yeah, that's all bullshit. Because those communities are what the government decided they should have. They don't actually represent. So Serpent River, where my family's from, small community, 350 people live there. They were Anishinaabe. Their territory stretched straight through the Midwest of the US, of what is now called the US. So the idea that they would be limited to this small territory is not their decision. It was the decision of the state. Again, storytelling. So now Canadians go, well, there's 613 and they're here, but that's not what it was. They were placed there, they were moved there, sometimes forcibly. The second thing the Indian Act did was it gave the government, here, imagine this piece of storytelling, gave the government the ability to determine who is Indigenous and who is not. So in my wallet, I can even take it out for you, I carry a little card. There it is. This is my, it even says on it, Certificate of Indian Status. So this is the government, the federal government, deciding that I'm Indigenous, which is hilarious and incredibly horrible at the same time. So they decide who gets it, and just to tell you how arbitrary it is, I have my status. My cousin, who's my cousin, but had the unfortunate, at least when it comes to Indian status, unfortunate birth after 1984. She was born after 1984. Well, the government decided after 1984 rules are different, so she doesn't have status. Completely arbitrary, but it's storytelling. And I won't give you the speech about why it was important to give the state to do this, but you can imagine why it would be important to a colonial state to be able to determine who actually holds the treaty rights on the other side than they do. So if you can imagine you're a company, you've signed a contract, and you get to decide who's in that other company, how that might work, and whether that might be considered, conflict of interest in today's sort of language. And the other thing the Indian Act did was it instituted what we call here in Canada, residential schools. And there were residential schools in the States. They had them in Australia as well. They were called mission schools there. But same idea, these were schools run in cooperation between the state and the church, many churches, and Indigenous kids were meant to go there to learn the non-Indigenous ways of life. That was, I think, the intent anyway. We've had an entire truth and reconciliation process around what happened at the residential schools, so I won't go into it heavily. You can Google it. But kids, I'll just say this. Each residential school came with its own attached cemetery, to give you an idea of their thinking around that. So I don't know if your kid's school has a cemetery attached to it for where the kids, when they died, would be buried. But that's what we had. My grandmother went to a residential school, St. Joseph's School for Girls. She went when she was 6 years old in 1933. It's a school in Spanish, Ontario, just north of here, run by the nuns. They used to beat her and torture her there so that she wouldn't speak her language. And in 1884, so they amended, this is now 17 years old, Canada is, they amended the Indian Act, and they added something that was called the potlatch ban. And this is where we get into the storytelling piece. Now the potlatch ban, the potlatch is a ceremony that occurs on the west coast of Canada. For many of the nations there want to run something called a potlatch. It's a big gathering where the nations gather together and trade and share stories. And the Canadian government felt this was a threat to their own national identity. And so they outlawed them. You couldn't do this ceremony on the West Coast. But it also banned pretty much any Indigenous ceremony. And as I said at the beginning, we didn't see the difference between, say, dancing and culture and art practice. So it effectively actually banned our art because it meant we couldn't dance, which was ceremony but also storytelling. And this actually allowed museums from all over the world, because we were no longer allowed to use our ceremonial objects to tell stories. So museums all over the world were allowed to come in and take them, and they would actually do their own bit of storytelling where they would mount them in their museums, and non-Indigenous curators would tell you what they mean and you would now begin to learn about Indigenous people from non-Indigenous people. And in fact, you can still go to the Royal Ontario Museum in downtown Toronto. Probably if you have a history museum that has any totem pole or any artifact from First Nations people, all of that is pretty much stolen stuff that was taken during this potlatch ban period. And so we weren't really allowed to tell our own stories. My grandmother entered the residential school knowing all of the traditional stories, and when she came out, she didn't tell them anymore. She also went in only knowing Anishinaabemowin, our language. She came out and she never spoke it again. She was in the school for 10 years when they finally let her out. So we have to look at how those sorts of pressures actually meant that some of what storytelling is in Canada has been missed. Canada has an incomplete story about itself because it decided it wanted an incomplete story. It was more convenient for Canada for that to happen. And this has now cascaded into a lot of present day problems for Indigenous people and our relationship to the state, as well as our understanding between each other. Because what happened, so the potlatch ban went from 1884 to 1951. The US also had a very similar law called the Pagan Acts Law, which also banned Indigenous ceremonies and also any African or Caribbean ceremonies that may have also been present. And that law was on the books until 1978. So they really went for the whole 100 years on that one. And then they passed something called the Religious Freedom Act, which then allowed those ceremonies to return. But think about what happened in that. So 70 years was Canada's. You know, that's a long time. So there were Indigenous kids born and died never having spoken their own language or heard their own stories in that time. But also think about what Canada and the world even was doing during those 70 years. Right? During those 70 years in Canada, the CBC was founded. The National Film Board was founded. Most of our major museums and galleries were founded. When cultural appropriation was not just a theoretical thing, it was actually the law of the land. Indigenous people were not allowed to practice our culture. Non-Indigenous people could take it and do with it what they wanted. That's literally the definition of it. And so all of these institutions were founded, all of these practices, all of these stories were founded at a time when we weren't allowed to practice our own storytelling and our own cultures. In fact, we weren't even allowed to vote in Canada until 1967. And so when you have that sort of inequality baked into the systems, you're going to still have a storytelling issue decades down the road. And Canada wonders why it's so confused about itself. This is why. If you can't be honest in your story to yourself as a nation, you're just never going to totally get it right. And Indigenous people have been really working hard to reclaim and restore these stories. But I also want to say, just think of the loss, not just the loss for me, but the loss for the world, that those stories were not told and those are now gone. What have we missed in all of this? And it's been an extraordinary loss for our communities, but I'd suggest for Canada and the world as well. And we still suffer from misunderstandings that have been created by others telling stories about us. Because what also happened in that 70 years? Movies happened. Movies happened, right? The first cinema shot in North America in 1894 in upstate New York by Thomas Edison and his engineer, William K. Dixon, was of Indigenous performers. The very first movie. But it happened 10 years after those laws were passed. So in fact, you can Google this after, you can go watch Edison's, they're called the Buffalo Dance and the Ghost Dance, done by performers from the Buffalo Bill Cody Wild West show. And he filmed them. And what I would point out is the dances you see in those movies were illegal for them to perform in their home communities. The only place they were legal to be performed was for a white man's camera or for white audiences. And in fact, in 1890, in a place called Pine Ridge, that's now called Pine Ridge in the US, the American military killed 300 indigenous people, Sioux people, for performing the very dances that were shown in those Edison films. And so that storytelling imbalance, when you have Westerns telling the story of America, and we had a similar, we didn't call them Westerns, they were called frontier movies here in Canada, but it was Canada and the US telling their own creation story to themselves. It unfortunately came at the cost of our stories and our own people, which now means that these countries now struggle with their identity because they missed a big part of it. And as such, our health, and we've really suffered, I would say, by not being able to tell our stories. We still face enormous inequality in the systems here in Canada. If you're Canadian, you're probably somewhat familiar with this. If you're not Canadian, my daughter is 5 to 14 times more likely to be murdered than an average Canadian's daughter, just because she's First Nations. The prison population, in a place like, I'll use Saskatchewan, one of the provinces, a province of 22% Indigenous population, 90% of those in prison are Indigenous in Saskatchewan. We have a suicide crisis in our community. You know that in 2015 in the north in Nunavut, suicide was the #1 cause of death. It beat cancer and heart attacks. Our government, which actually just decided to seek a judicial review around a human rights tribunal ruling that said they've been unfairly treating Indigenous kids for decades and decades and ruled that they should compensate them, they're now challenging that in court. And in the time since that ruling first landed, and now 102 Indigenous children have died, while the government has resisted that ruling. So we still face enormous inequities. Our health, our sovereignty, our nations remained under-recognized because of this storytelling and artistic inequity. And contributing to that is, all of that is the lack of knowledge of our stories. If you knew our stories, we'd be human, it would be much harder to do this. This is why you all go tell stories later today, because you're humans and you want to be seen as humans with other people. But when our stories were taken from us, and they're still here, and where you can find them is in the art, because artists are very smart. And so even if we couldn't practice our traditional storytelling, well, then they would paint something and it would be in the painting. And so if you want to find out what the Indigenous history is, one of the best places to start, because it's not in the Canadian history books and it's not in the world history books, is actually to start with Indigenous artists who've been telling this story from the very beginning. And Canada is currently being completely transformed by Indigenous artists and Indigenous stories. I think the understanding of what this place is, who we are, the potential of Canada, because I would say Canada is actually still fairly far from reaching its potential, is all there for us to seize if we start embracing this storytelling, including, by the way, addressing some of the environmental catastrophes that we are facing. So I would ask you, when you're thinking of the importance of storytelling in artistic practice, to consider who gets to tell stories and make art and why. Why them? And who doesn't get to do those things? Are there people whose stories aren't being heard or that you don't know, but you know they exist? Because those are going to be gaps. Now, I said at the beginning that I would talk about the images we're seeing on screen. I hope it's been flowing through. And if you'll notice the commonality with them, a lot of forests, right? I love forests, and I'm going to tell you an Anishinaabe teaching about the forest. And so I hope everyone here has been to a forest, right? Raise your hand if you've never been to a forest. Thank goodness. I did that once and someone raised their hand. We immediately had to get them out into the bush. Good, so you've all been to a forest. So if you were in a forest and you looked around, this is a pretty good example of a forest. That's probably, I don't know where that is. That looks like up north of northern Ontario with the big rock there. And if you look at the forest, one of the things you might notice is there only one kind of tree in the forest? No. There's a lot of different trees I can just see in that picture, all sorts of bushes. Is there one kind of animal? No, there's not. There's all sorts of animals, all sorts of trees and plants and insects and fish and birds, and that's because diversity, inclusion, is the way of nature. If we talk about how Mother Nature, if we want to think of her as designing anything, well, she designs everything for the most diversity she could possibly fit into it. Now, we call this, some scientists will call this biodiversity, but I don't think you need the bio. It's just diversity. Now, have you ever been to a forest where all the trees are in a row? Because if you've been to Northern Ontario, you've seen this, where all the trees are in a row, or all the trees are actually the same. They're in a row, same tree. If you go chop down a Christmas tree, you'll see this phenomenon on the tree farm. Now, what's interesting about those places is those weren't designed by Mother Nature. Those are humans that planted trees like that. A human decided to make a forest that wasn't diverse. And so I think what I'm trying to tell you, actually I don't think, this is what I'm telling you, is that when you find yourself in a forest or a boardroom or an office space or an event or any space, virtual or non, and it's not diverse, a human has interrupted the process. That you're either in a space built by humans, or you're in a space moderated and controlled by humans, but you aren't in a natural space, because nature does this, right? Nature does not pick one set. And so if you're in a space like that, realize that, one, not diverse. So people are not being included. Something is missing, right? And as we talked about, if you don't hear the stories from those people, you won't gain their knowledge, you won't understand who they are, you won't necessarily be able to serve them in the same way that you would other people's whose story you know, whose stories you're familiar with. But when you find yourself in those spaces, the key thing to understand immediately is that humans decided for that space to be that way, and humans can decide for that space to not be that way. That those constructed realities are of our own creation. They are not how the world actually naturally works. We want more, the more diverse, the better and healthier a forest is, right? The less diverse, toast. It's a farm. It's a commercial enterprise to be harvested. It's not a living and breathing thing. So when you're designing, because I know I'm in a room full of designers, when you're designing a space, design a forest. Design something where it will naturally be like this and not trees all in a row. Because that way you'll actually hear the stories that maybe you didn't know before. You'll see the people that you maybe didn't necessarily before, and you'll be able to build something that will serve them better than if you just build something for the stories you actually know. And it's a real challenge, but we actually have to build things for the eventuality we can't see, right? There's a wonderful saying, you don't plant the tree to enjoy the shade yourself, you plant the tree so people you will never meet will enjoy the shade. Another forest metaphor, conveniently. So that's it, I think. Well, we missed some of the slides, but trust me, they're beautiful. And be like that. When you're in your work, in your life, this is why I say go walk the garden later today, because what you'll see is a very diverse space where Mother Nature has made space for a whole lot of stories to be told. And that is actually the goal we need when we're building organizations, when we're building our homes, our communities, our nations, everything. That's what we need. Thank you so much for listening. Miigwech, 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 chi miigwech.